Morning. I'm going to go ahead and get started with a few announcements and then lead into the presentation. Don't mean to interrupt. I know we have a long day of events going on both here in the Civic Center as well as all around town, so I hope you can kind of plan things out accordingly. There's a lot of other talks in the other rooms, so I don't mind if you need to get up, go check something else out. There's a lot of cool stuff to see today and tomorrow as well. So I appreciate everyone coming out. This is the second day of the 2023 Roswell Incident. My name is Daniel Allen Jones, and I'm honored to be representing the Roswell Daily Record. And I also do a number of other things. I'm going to go ahead and share a little bit about myself. I'm a musician by trade. It's my day job. I'm a private music teacher and a drummer. And as far as my involvement with a lot of these other interesting topics when it comes to the unexplained, I'm fascinated with the whole gamut of all of these different subjects. I'm an investigative reporter and have been influenced in part by my friend, the late Jim Mars, who is a big reason why I'm involved with any of this stuff, and a big reason why I'm going to be discussing the particular topic today. Who doesn't know what I'm going to be talking about here? I think everyone who's here probably knows or maybe doesn't. If not, I'll get into that here in just a moment. I also, because I study anthropology and I work in a lot of other capacities, I'm really interested in the work that I do contributing to citizen science and journalism. I consider myself an amateur anthropologist and archaeologist. I'm fascinated with ancient mysteries and ancient sites, as well as what we can understand by looking at artifacts and trying to understand some of the things zoologically that we see and connect with. So I'm fascinated with all of these things. I'm also a sort of history, wildlife enthusiast, and enjoy the outdoors, and I just have a great time going out to these events. I've been involved. I've come out to Roswell probably about a dozen times now. How many of you guys have been here before? Maybe about half of us. So that's really awesome. Definitely keep coming back. This is an annual festival. Garners the attention of tens of thousands of people all over the world. So it's great to see the involvement. You guys coming out and checking out, being a part of the discussion is really important to keep this momentum going. There's so much happening right now. We can talk about so many things all day long, but I'm going to actually get into a very specific topic here. My media platform is called the Vortex. I do interviews, I do on-location segments, and have presentations very similar to this, not just of myself, but many other presenters and researchers and those who've been involved in many ways, which you can go check out on YouTube. Like I said, I'm a musician. This is my band. We tour all over the galaxy. We have a pretty good time. They couldn't make it. They had another obligation, unfortunately, so it's just me for this day. But you can go check out. I manage a page that has about a little over 5,000 people on it. It's called the Texas UFO Network. And it's a reporting center. We share news, different things like that. So it's a really great hub for information and resources. So there's that one there. And of course, today's lecture is going to be on the Aurora, Texas legend of 1897. How many of you guys have heard of Aurora or the story about what you think is Aurora? That's cool. I'm really glad. So I feel like if you're familiar with some of these ideas, you'll probably know. But what I found is some people know little bits and pieces. They know about the idea of like the windmill or the crash or the well or that little alien in his grave, all of that, right? Well, there's a lot more to it, and I should just go ahead and tell you, I'm not here to convince anyone that it happened or that it was a hoax. What I've done is I look at many of these types of things through the lens of the historicity and its value when it comes to the implications of what we can understand through the investigations that have been done, and not just looking at the original story itself, but the subsequent involvement by many people over the last century plus at this point. So really interesting things going on. I'll backtrack a little bit. So again, the title is The Aurora, Texas Legend, the UFO Crash and Alien Grave of 1897. And it's very sensational, and this is some pretty dramatic artwork that I threw together, but I think it's an interesting story, and I'll mention this again. I regard it, whether it's fact, fiction, or folklore, it's important that we look into this and we share about information that we can have as far as how it inspires what we're looking at today and the possibilities of what it might help for us to understand about what's happening now. So Texas, which is where I'm from, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, is not really too far from Aurora. Aurora is actually down the street from Fort Worth, but Texas is no stranger to strange phenomena. As this article over here, and the Denison Daily News actually says about something a farmer named John Martin north of Dallas saw what he described as a saucer. This is in 1878, well before Kenneth Arnold said he saw some objects that were crescent-shaped that had movements like saucers, which got spun into the media to flying saucers back 76 years ago. This is well before that. And so That's really interesting. Of course, we have what's called the Marfa lights, which you can still go see today. They're interesting, unexplained phenomena that, is a recurring thing. It wasn't one thing that happened one time that someone told about. Any of us could go out there tonight and probably see these lights. It's about 4 hours from here if you ever get a chance. It's really cool. Historical plaques that show some interesting things. It even talks about UFOs, as well as one of the ideas, the proposed theories. But one of the other interesting ideas of the historical phenomenon that we could see regarding UFOs traces back to what we call, and well beyond this, of course, too, but something known as the Great Airship Mystery. How many of you guys have heard of this sort of being floated around in the lore of UFOs? It's been a big, deep-seated topic in ufology. It dates back to the 1800s and maybe even before that. But the Dallas Morning News, which is still in publication today, wrote an article, and on the 5th page, not even the front headlines, the 5th page talked about the Gray Aerial Wanderer. And so UFOs, that nomenclature didn't exist at the time. They called them airships or arrows and things like this. So in the middle of about a dozen or more airship stories in Texas, and this was happening all over the Midwest and California and Sacramento and San Francisco and places like this as well, they were describing these aerial vehicles, dirigibles, and objects which people were seeing that didn't seem to be like disc shapes so much as the aforementioned John Martin had seen, but something a little bit more tangible that looked like an inventor would make with wings, portholes, things that seemed a little bit more human-like, but just ahead of the time. Except for the story in the very middle there about a windmill demolishes it, as it was called. There is S.E. Hayden, probably one of the only known pictures to ever exist of the original author. I had to track this down. It's pretty cool how I came up on this, but there's the original article. So this was written in 1897 in April on the 19th, which it was reported on the 19th, describing an event that happened 2 days prior on the 17th. So this is a really interesting story. This is how it all originated. For most people, this is the source of this story. I'm going to break it down, but before I do, we're going to take a little quick trip to Aurora just to kind of orient you guys about where that is. And of course, there's U.S. and South America, and then here's the U.S. Texas. You can see the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We're kind of zooming in. And north, the very top left corner there, northwest of Fort Worth, we have Aurora. It's about 20 minutes. And so that's the small town of Aurora. It's not very big. You drive right through it if you didn't know where you were going, what you were looking at. And I think, if you were looking for the crash side, the grave side, you're all within about a mile proximity of these things. So leading into the 1890s, there are maps, there have been maps at least, of many of the different things. Aurora used to be one of the lively, most active towns in what's called Wise County, which is right outside of Tarrant County, which is where I live in Fort Worth. And it's one of those things that had kind of turn of events that changed the scope of the town. And just to let you guys know, I'm going to be flying through a lot of information. I know it's the very start of the day. I appreciate everyone's willingness to come here at the very beginning. So hopefully this kind of energy will carry us through the rest of the day and into tomorrow as well. And if you have any questions, please get with me afterward because I'll probably fill in the entire time. And I don't want to carry over because we have a long schedule of events. So there's a lot of history. There's a lot of people who have come forward in subsequent years to try and make sense of this really interesting story. In the 1890s, it became sort of a dying town for a number of reasons. It was established in 1870s, had a post office, had a number of other things, thousands of people, and then unfortunately they had spotted fever, sort of an epidemic that made a lot of the people in the town either unfortunately pass away or go on a mass exodus to leave, and they thought pretty much there's nothing left for us here. So a lot of people died and left the town. The railroad did have plans to go through, which kind of was their saving grace, they thought, but they abandoned that, and so it literally became a ghost town, and a few people remained. And of course, the idea as to people who consider it was all the story, which I'll be talking about, was a hoax, was that basically the town was dying and they needed to concoct a story to drive people back in and help promote commerce and industry and all these things, or tourism, by using what we now call fake news, which I think, you can make sense of why that might be the case. I've come up with reasons on both ends, the best reasons that have been given or proposed as to why it happened or didn't happen. But again, I'm not here to convince you. I won't even say make up your own mind, because you all will anyways, whether I show you something or not. I think that's one of the interesting things, is that I can always show you this stuff, but people will tell me, they say it happened. Oh, for sure, it's the smoking gun, as my buddy Jim would say, or that it was all hoax. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts as we go through all of this. But Let's break down the original story. So here we have a windmill demolishes it in Aurora in Wise County, Texas, April the 17th, to the news about 6 o'clock this morning. To the early riders of Aurora were astonished at the sudden appearance of the airship which has been sailing through the country. So a bit of commentary, again, the airship was sometimes referred to as a singular idea, singular phenomenon that was sailing through, that came through California and all these other states. But it's impossible to think that it was one, because all of these states, all of the reports, all at the same time, if 99% of the reports were just made up, it's hard to discount the dozens, if not hundreds of reports all over the U.S. and probably beyond of people seeing things on the same days in concentrated areas. So I do think that there was something to what people were seeing. To keep going, it was traveling due north and much nearer the Earth than ever before. Evidently, some of the machinery was out of order, for it was making a speed of only 10 or 12 miles an hour and gradually settling toward the Earth. It sailed directly over the public square, and when it reached the north part of town, collided with the tower of Judge Proctor's windmill and went to pieces with a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground, wrecking the windmill and water tank, and destroying the judge's flower garden. It's tragic. The pilot of the ship is supposed to have been the only one on board, and while his remains are badly disfigured, enough of the original has been picked up to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world. That's a pretty sensational headline to make for anything, but this is in the newspaper. Mr. T.J. Weems, the United States Signal Service officer at this place and an authority on astronomy, gives it of his opinion that he was a native of the planet Mars. Interesting, and some people don't realize science fiction was in its infancy. The following year, you had War of the Worlds, ideas of Martians, space aliens, invaders, all these people from other planets. That was in the sort of social psyche at the time. These were ideas. People don't really think they didn't come out until the 50s and 60s with sort of modern science fiction, but people were thinking about this. It was in the literature, obviously in a completely different format in how society works now, but there were some things out there to inspire these ideas. Papers found on his person, this is the pilot, evidently the record of his travels, are written in some unknown hieroglyphics and cannot be deciphered. So it's interesting how you have these correlations between some kind of symbology, iconography, symbols that you see in other instances, such as the Roswell I-beam that the Marcel family describes seeing, and others too, that there are these strange symbols on objects, debris, craft, insignias. Really interesting how some of these things have been mentioned in the original story. And of course, the ship was too badly wrecked to form any conclusion as to its construction or motive power. It was built of an unknown metal resembling somewhat a mixture of aluminum and silver, and it must have weighed several tons. So anyone who's followed up with the crash retrieval research, the metallic samples of alloys that have been analyzed and shown to typically be high concentrations of aluminum is pretty curious, considering they were talking about this way back then. And of course, the town is full of people today who are viewing the wreck and gathering specimens of the strange metal from the debris. The pilot's funeral will take place at noon tomorrow. Signed S.E. Hayden, Samuel Edwards Hayden. Keep in mind, this is 6 brothers before the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk with their flyer, which is sort of considered the modern, initiation of aviation. So this is pre-aviation, when people were seeing not just this idea of the Aurora story, but all of these airship accounts. Pretty incredible to think that there were things in the sky when there technically weren't supposed to, but obviously it's very likely that other, even inventors, and not even in any way extraterrestrial, craft were up there, although that's a possibility too, for sure. But, to think that no one was doing this before them, I think is a little bit naive, in that, they just got the notoriety for being aviators. And I think that's important to acknowledge as well, seeing how far we've come, and in many ways thanks to those innovators. So I'm going to jump through a bit of a chronology. So my focus in a lot of this, as I mentioned, isn't to prove or convince or try to establish a sense of why you should believe this story or not believe it, but to show you the ways in which it's been included in all multimedia over the last century plus really. And to be honest, since about the late 60s, something has been published, produced, or examined and investigated regarding the Aurora legend every single year since the late 60s. And I think it's probably next to Roswell as being one of the most publicized UFO-related stories in the entire world. Many people don't realize that. I really do think it's probably one of the biggest ones. So starting out, of course, in the early 1900s, there were some pioneer history books written which admittedly did not include anything about the Aurora story. Cliff Cates wrote The Pioneer History of Wise County, which was not just about Aurora, but did show all of these different things that basically had to do with very simple and mundane aspects of life, agriculture, trade, things like that, land, acquisitions, all of these things. But doesn't mention anything about a spaceship or things like this. And of course, unfortunately, as I mentioned, Aurora had a really hard time for several decades. After the railroad bypassed the town, people left. And the post office opened, it closed, it wasn't around for very long, so people had a hard time maintaining interest in why they should even keep Aurora around. In 1914, the post office was commandeered into becoming a school, and they tried to get things going again. These are historical photographs that I've been able to have the fortune of working with one of the historical committees with, digitizing and archiving. There's a class photo of 1922. Some of these people, well, if it's a class photo, they probably wouldn't have been around a little bit earlier to actually have been a witness, but might be relatives to those who were. Of course, no one's left alive at that point. I found and located the grave of Thomas Jefferson Weems, or T.J. Weems, who was the one who speculated that it was an inhabitant of the planet Mars, which is really incredible how that set the Aurora legend story on the outside of all the other airship stories, because he insinuated that it was of non-human origin, and it wasn't just some inventor in California, like many of the airship stories were speculated to have been. So unfortunately, he passed away in 25, whereas many of the inhabitants lived for decades later. In the 30s, a lot actually helped to establish Aurora again, and so you've got the Wise County Messenger, which is their local newspaper, basically telling about things that happened decades before and giving sort of commemorative anniversary publications. Finally, they had a highway that went through town and kept going all the way through the state, which helped to get more people to know that there is a place called Aurora and that it's not an isolated little ghost town anymore. It's called Highway 114. We'll bring that back up. And so coming down through the decades, a lot's happened. So many people, in the town, kind of by word of mouth and just knowing relatives, heard about the legend or the story. At the time, it wasn't a legend, And in the 40s, a family which had lived in the area, the Oates family, moves onto the property of Judge Proctor's, where the windmill would have been, along with the water tower and the well. And they inadvertently found out about this because they had people come onto their property and ask them over the years. So they had an ARCO station, or the ACRO station there, where it was a gas station basically, and they had people come and tell them about what they thought about the metal and want to come see it. And they said, well, you're welcome to do whatever you'd like. And this is over several years. This is probably a little bit after the 40s, this picture here, but they removed the debris from the well. The idea is that this cigar-shaped object crashed coming down from the south, exploded when it crashed into this windmill, destroying the water tank, and that the debris, which it said there was quite a bit of, was taken and thrown down the well, probably also discarded, and people hauled it off. People took specimens, as it says, and also, it was put in, some of it seemed to have been alleged to have been put in the coffin with the body, the pilot. So lots of metal, mystery metal is a common theme in a lot of these UFO cases, crash cases especially, and people like from the government coming in trying to figure out what to do with it. So the Oates family wanted to use that well, which again is connected to the windmill, sort of all together working system. And they said they discarded a lot of the debris that was thrown down that well because they wanted to use it for drinking. And apparently they started doing so in 1945. And we all know what happened mostly, think we have an idea about what happened 2 years later. And one thing I'll just mention is that this is not a Roswell presentation, and I want to really focus too much on this, but the interesting connection is that these were taken in Fort Worth, which is just down the road from Aurora. So you guys might recognize Jesse Marcel and General Roger Ramey holding up what looks like aluminum tinfoil, describing a weather balloon, as they were told to show and hold a press release for the public to actually kind of give an idea about what it was supposed to have been recovered out, north of here, about an hour to 2 hours, near Corona, more specifically. And Jesse Marcel senior there claims that that stuff that he's holding is definitely not what he found out in the desert. But other people say that it was all a weather balloon and all these other things too. But just the connection of how close the proximity, 50 years after the Aurora incident, that debris from another and probably the most famous or infamous UFO crash related incident was taken just down the road to Aurora, or to Fort Worth near Aurora. And it makes us wonder, are there any particular reasons why, or is that just a synchronous type of occurrence? Moving on, in the 50s, some interesting paperwork was discovered showing some of these locals, Harold Bost, basically started interviewing the old-timers and people in town, not about the legend, but just to ascertain the information that they had to kind of compile into a bit of history that was recommended for publication. It was for a class, actually. He got a B+, and they recommended that he publish it in the local Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and it did make some news. But every person he interviewed, the only thing that I can say is close to this relating to the story is basically that he asked, did Aurora have an original newspaper? And the answer is yes, it did. The idea is that S.E. Hayden was a stringer for the local paper and actually just wrote it in the paper along with Judge J.S. Proctor to concoct this story. They wrote, and the Proctors and his family actually did work as publicists and for the local paper. So there's a lot of really interesting connections, but the idea is that maybe the original story was written in the Aurora News and then relayed to the Dallas Morning News, and then another subsequent publication called the Fort Worth Register, which is now defunct. So this gave no indication that anyone knew anything about a spaceship crash or a legend or anything like that, but there was indication that people did have newspapers in Aurora specifically that could have had it. To continue on, after 12 years of drinking that well water, they found there were some problems that they were not really feeling very good about. That's the Oates family, of course, who lived on Proctor's property, and so they sealed that well off after 12 years. It's kind of hard to see, so here it says Oates, 1957, on the seal of the well. So unfortunately, we'll see some of the things that may have happened to the Oates family. And here, starting in 64 and onward, this is where everything about Aurora started to explode in sort of the public scope of the world. Otherwise, it had been sort of concentrated in a local, regional type of idea or concept up until the late 60s, where in here the messenger, the Wise County Messenger, talks about sort of a dilapidated shack here, says, don't look for it on the map, it's not going to be there, so it wouldn't be until a few years later where that would totally change, and then the whole world would know. So starting in 65 and onward, there's a lot. So this is a saga, it's a bit of a poem by Oedip Geese, who would later on be more involved with the historical committee. It's a fun idea, nice poetry, does not mention the legend at all. 66. Somehow, and Jacques Vallée and others are largely responsible for digging back up the old airship cases and looking in. Charles Fort, in his Book of the Damned in 1919, was one of the first UFO books ever that mentions the idea of airships and other aerial and unexplained phenomena and how it's related to some of the other instances of what Keel calls high strangeness and all these other really interesting things. So in 66, as this was all being dug back up, people all over the world caught the attention of these stories, the airships, specifically Aurora. So investigators of international disposition came out, looked into the sites, the crash site, the grave site, all these things, and it started to get in the news. A Dr. Alfred Krauss from the Kilgore Institute, which is in West Texas, who's a scientist, came out and he tried to examine the sites with metal detectors. He found some old stove pots and license plates, but couldn't find any anomalous metal. He kind of thought there wasn't probably really much to it, but he was intrigued enough to go out there. The following year, this is when things really started to explode in the local newspapers. There's a lot of really incredible headlines, things like crash at Aurora, only one in long list of tragedies in early 1897. And so it's interesting how they're talking about all those other airship stories, but they point out how Aurora, as you'll see, is probably a little bit more eclectic when it comes to these airship stories. Now, Brawley Oates, who's the sort of the patriarch of the Oates family, is the one who's on that property, sealed off that well. He tells people about that tragedy, or depending on the publication, they have a different sort of angle on the whole thing. You can see it says hoax, spaceship crash still draws visitors, and all these other things. Wise County reports your tops. So it got attention, and of course, newspapers like that. It's something that, is attention grabbing, and it helps them sell papers, as, many of them try to do. In tabloids, of course, can get really sensational, but, this is something we'll see. The headlines will be utilized in many different ways depending on who's writing it, if they like the story or not. So in 68, people came forward and said, I lived there. I was alive when that happened, or didn't happen. And so people would decry it, like this person, Robbie Hansen. She said, I was there, it was all a hoax. And it was just a joke. It was a practical joke because they were jokesters. They were bored in town, whittling away, and wanted to try to draw people in. So, some people would say the exact opposite of what we'd see. But Frank Talbert was a writer, and he published many articles on it. And he tried to just talk to people around town and just share what they said. Wasn't really much of an investigative reporter by today's standards, but he would just share local stories. In 69, Rosalie Gregg, again with the Wise County Historical Survey Committee and other things, really tried to look into where the origins of this Aurora legend came from. Was there inspiration from earlier texts, literature at the time, anything that could have caused them to say, hey, we can just borrow from this or that? So they thought they were onto something called Across the Zodiac, which had a similar sort of account of aerial phenomena and things. So nothing really came of that, but there could be some inspiration. Obviously, we know stories get traded around, and there's a lot of word by mouth, obviously, way before the information age. There again, Frank Talbert talks about it being a hoax in the 70s, and of course, Jerry Flemons with the other publications in the area discussed this in a Southern Living editorial, and then, of course, the Wise County, History of Wise County got republished. That one from 1907 became republished on hardback, so it's actually, important that they're looking back, they're trying to bring their history back into sort of the current paradigm. And so, as the years continued, the town bolstered up enough attention to become incorporated as a city once again. And as you can see, they got Brawley Oates up there at his gas station, and he's hiding away his arms, which you'll see why. They do have a grave and sort of these other things you can see up here in a moment. Now, 1973, there's so much going on. I'm going to fly through a lot of this. The sensationalism of the headlines is very unique, considering people think that the idea of what's happening now with the idea of crash cases or materials that the government's looking into studying retrieved non-human technologies and things like this, that this is all new. But this is being written about 50 years ago now, made national headlines. My buddy, the late Jim Mars, was on location with a number of other investigators from other groups like MUFON, the now defunct International UFO Bureau with Peyton Hughes, and a number of other groups who came down and really discovered that there's so much there to try to figure out. So these headlines are a lot of fun. UFO expert Stu at Aurora, it's getting serious. Rest in peace. They call him the spaceman. They don't really say alien a whole lot. They call him the spaceman, which is kind of affectionate, I guess. And there's just so many of these really interesting headlines. Just a few of dozens, and these are actual pictures that I took of original copies. You can go onto newspapers.com and some of these archives and track all these down too. They're really cool. But again, depending on who's writing and what publication, they have a different take on if it was like real, or if there's something to it, if it was all hoax. So really cool headlines all throughout this. Some fun artwork. The one over here says, "Here comes another nosy reporter to ask about the spaceman's grave." It's it's a spaceship with an alien getting out, and then of course this one's like a space station with an astronaut saying, "You can't miss it. Just take US 81 north to Rome." There's a Rome next to Aurora, and turn left on Highway 114, and you're in Aurora. And there it says Venus Tours. So pretty cool out there. They're kind of poking fun at it. And of course, like I said, my buddy Jim Mars, he was writing in the Star Telegram, the local Fort Worth Star Telegram. Before, if you're familiar with Jim, he wrote extensively on many topics and had several best-selling books. This is well before all that. He was really vested in a lot of this stuff. So he was there 50 years ago. Space crash site, hunt futile. No radiation clues found. So people were investigating. They were using scanning, Geiger counters, metal detectors. They were finding bits of metal. And the really cool thing is, because of some of the metal that was analyzed, they found out that Dr. Tom Gray at the University of North Texas, where I went to school, looked at it and found some strange things in the analysis that were high concentrations of aluminum and zinc, which is something we're hearing today. If you hear about some of the samples that were found at the Roswell debris field, the impact site, things like this. There's high concentrations of aluminum, and in today's standards, that's not too unexpected. Back in 1897, which is 26 years ago now, it's something that probably was very unlikely, not impossible, but very improbable for anyone to have aluminum. It wasn't mass produced back then. So unfortunately, Brawley Oates at the time basically came out and said, hey, I've had some severe health issues that he attributed to drinking that well water, which he said it was because it was radiated by the space alien, the spaceman, in his spaceship crash. You can see his hands, unfortunately, badly malformed. He had arthritis and a number of problems that he thought it was because he drank that water. That's why he sealed off that well. There are no medical records that I know of that can substantiate those claims, but it would be interesting to see how, as many of us who've looked into this for a while know, that there are physiological effects of people who are in close proximity to what we now refer to as UAP. That is a legitimate thing that's been acknowledged, and I think it's important that we look into, has this been happening for a long time, 50 years or more now? So it's very possible that this could be a big way that corroborates the story. In some people's eyes, that's the giveaway. It could be. In 73, and by the way, there's this headstone in the grave down at the cemetery. There was a small headstone, and Jim had some pictures. He shared these with me before he passed, of the original headstone in 1973. There's a little boy, there's a guy. It's not very big, it's not a traditional headstone, it's kind of broken off, and here it is, a large picture of it that Jim gave me. And he says he always thought this was kind of cool, that he thought it was a broken half of a full image of a spaceship, that the other half of the stone kind of showed, as you can see, completing the full picture of the ship with little porthole windows and things. So it could be, it's hard to say, but of course, as the investigators descended upon Aurora in troves, the town went crazy. The International UFO Bureau wanted to legally exhume the body. They were very serious about trying to figure out what's going on in that grave. The Cemetery Association threatened with a counter lawsuit and pretty much put a halt on that. And they held a cemetery watch because of that for 2 weeks or more. And as soon as that cemetery watch was over, the gravestone went missing, and there were holes, like drill holes, found in the site. So again, Jim Martz, he was on location. He asked aviation writer Bill Case for the Dallas Morning News, the same publication as the original story, who do you think did this? Because he was constantly writing about it, which garnered the national attention of the Associated Press, and this was published all over. And so people just came from everywhere. And while it's interesting to think maybe in Bill's response to Jim asking who was the government, and he unfortunately passed away. Bill Case passed away the year later. Whether the government did it or not, or took samples or core samples, whatever, we don't know. But a lot of people became familiar with Aurora because of all the stories that were being published. So unfortunately, the last part of that whole year became sort of a disappointing moment for a lot of those investigators, because the Cemetery Association blocked pretty much anyone's ability to legally exhume the body. And so for the following year, they just had back and forth legal battles, and that's what a lot of the headlines kind of get into, is that they really couldn't move forward with the investigation. But a lot continued to happen. In 75, a book came out from, again, the historical committee person, Rosalie Gregg, called The History of Wise County, which started to include the lore and the history of where the story came from and the subsequent aftermath with these UFO people coming into town, along with a book specifically about Aurora, a history book called Aurora, the town that might have been. And not because of the spaceship, although that sort of inadvertently falls in, but that's Etta Pegues, who wrote some of those other things before. It's mainly about the reasons that it fell apart because of the epidemic, and they had the spotted fever, they had the bull weevil infestation, of course the railroad bypassed the town. That was the leading downfall. Of course, this story is probably the only reason why anyone knows about Aurora now. So 75 is kind of a up and coming time. Rosalie Gregg submitted a manuscript to the Texas Historical Commission, which was approved for a marker at the cemetery in 1976, which you can go see today. This is a picture I took of the original manuscript, and it talks about, this site is also well known because of the legend that a spaceship crashed here in 1897, and the pilot who was killed in the crash is buried here, which you can go to today. It's actually pretty cool that there's an official historical marker that acknowledges a spaceship from 1897. Whether that means it happened or not is either way. It's just kind of fun to know that that's a sort of a destination. In 77, Jim continues to write, about that in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. What happened in Aurora in 1897? A cigar-shaped spaceship allegedly crashed in town. So it just continues to get press coverage. Jim was really fascinated by it as well, and unfortunately the following year, Brawley Oates, the guy who drank the well water and got really messed up, he passes away. That's his headstone there in the Aurora Cemetery. And the following year, the Times Magazine of '79 actually interviewed Ed McGee's, and it was a very short column, and she says why the judge never had a windmill anyways. And so people said, well, that puts it to rest. People really took, the Time Magazine is a pretty big deal. It was back then, so people were like, well, that must be the true story then. It's put to rest. It's settled. There was no windmill. That must mean it's all a hoax, right? And now we're into the 80s, and this is kind of a really interesting time frame because it kept getting publicized. And this one, it says it's the most amazing UFO case of all time. That's pretty intense. In 82, you have journals, MUFON, and others publishing about it in interesting ways. We continue on into 83, which is an anniversary. So again, on April 17th, that's the anniversary. So it was an opportunity to share about what had happened or the subsequent things that, where the investigators found, whatever this is. So this is another Dallas Morning News, the same publication. Writer tried promoting hoax to save a dying town, the tale that wouldn't die. So they make it out like it's just, we're doing everything we can to just get it back, and no one's selling anything. No one's making any money off of doing this, by the way, other than maybe newspapers here and there selling a little bit of papers, but there weren't any gift shops or anything like this in town. It's nowhere near as big as Roswell. They don't have any infrastructure. Getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but we'll see what happens a little bit later on. More journals. The Skeptical Inquirer writes about it. 84 and 85. Rosalie Gregg has a lot of people. She becomes sort of a central person in town that people ask, send mail, physical mail to. Back then, that was kind of the way of communication for most people. And she's constantly getting mail, referring people, and her one-line response sometimes would be, it was a hoax. But she was still very helpful in providing resources and all these other things at the Wise County Historical Society. Here's the fun part. Okay, so in 86, a movie came out. Have you guys ever seen The Aurora Encounter? Who's ever seen this movie here before? I'm very surprised that anyone here has. That's awesome. Very cool. Now, okay, so we can go on about that. Now, I have an original theatrical release movie poster here that I came across, and at the time I got it, I wasn't told that it had anything. But this movie is kind of fun because it rides the coattails of E.T., which came out a few years before, which, as Spielberg is very much influenced by all of this stuff in almost all of his work. I say that in the sense that it's a nice alien movie. It's not a bad invaders where, it's something that turns out, they got to fight them and all that. It turns out that the people are the bad guys in this sort of movie. We kind of have a sort of lighthearted approach. And Mickey Hayes, who's the boy who plays the alien, had progeria, hence his sort of malformed appearance. Now, not to be derogatory about that, or that might seem weird to some people, it was actually a Make-A-Wish Foundation type of thing for him to actually want to play the alien in the movie, which he got to do, which is really cool. So I found out after getting this poster that it's signed. That's what it says right here. It's Mickey Hayes. He signed this poster. It might be one of the only ones ever. So it's pretty cool that he got to do that. And Jack Elam's probably the biggest known star in the movie, and he plays sort of the town rogue. To give you guys a little idea, here we go.
It was the end of a century, a time when flying was still a dream.
Wish me luck!
But dreams did come true. And in Aurora, Texas, where the people were ready for anything, along came Aurora Encounter. Some were surprised. Some were bewildered.
I had the great pleasure of not only playing checkers, but sharing my elixir with the little fellow that came out of that convention.
But a few figured it all out. Aurora Encounter. The difference between what is impossible and what is possible is in what you believe. Texas, it became the excitement, the experience, and the encounter that was out of this world. Aurora Encounter, America's first extraterrestrial adventure. Believe it or not.
Awesome. So, this is still on. You guys can probably hear me okay. Yeah, you know, kind of a B film. It's fun though. The cool thing though is the artist who did the art for this poster actually did so after being the artist for Return of the Jedi just a few years before. So imagine going from doing the art of Star Wars to doing this poster right here. Kazu Sano, very cool. This is the 40th anniversary of Return of the Jedi, so this is the Star Wars Aurora connection for all of the sci-fi enthusiasts there. And of course, as I said, depending on the publication, the publicist, there were mixed reviews. New film revives legend of Aurora space visitor. New movie digs up bones of spaceman legend. Or alternatively, Aurora, no close encounter of any kind. They're really like saying they're just trying to keep this thing alive. Or it paced well with kindly charm. So, you know, it's a fun, lighthearted movie. It's a complete divergent of the original story. It's like it takes some liberties. It's fun. It has everything. So it's cool. You know, and subsequently, you know, there's a lot more published about it. In Omni magazine in the following year, in '88, more MUFON journals come out. Kevin Randall, who's written extensively about Roswell and a number of other things, he wrote about it, and he was pretty much, you know, of the impression that it was all hoax. He actually came in the '70s, one of the first investigators to come and take a look, and he just said they didn't have, you know, enough to show that it was a real thing. It was a hoax, and he's still pretty much of that impression. And that's fair. This is a whole rabbit hole in and of itself. I looked into this for a while, but I won't mention anything more than Bob Lazar, of course. You guys probably have known this figure. He came out in '88, '89, talking about his involvement with Site 4 at Groom Lake, or Area 51, right? He says all of these incredible things. He's been featured all over the place by now. He's kind of one of these people who fits into this subject, you know, very, very much a dividing type of figure. But he talked about how he saw what he described as the Aurora craft. Now, not the original airship, but he's not the one who came up with this term. This code name, Aurora, was found in a defense bill, fiscal year '87, for an allocation of $500 million, which was what people thought was for like a black budget aviation stealth project, which it ended up being discovered later on it was something, but people threw around this name Aurora to refer to a reverse engineered alien spacecraft that was being used by the government, maybe of delta orientation or some kind of triangular configuration. But it's interesting how the names start to kind of connect the dots with some of these things. So there's a lot to that. People continue, Bill Sweetman and all these other people looked into the Aurora spy plane for years, because, you know, a lot of UFOs are probably human technology and in no way alien, although I don't think that accounts for every single sighting, but I do think that there are a lot of projects that we know for sure. I mean, look at the stealth bomber, stealth fighter. These things are, you know, at air shows now, but were for many years very secret. So we know that stealth aviation does take place, and so I just want to mention that the Aurora is kind of an interesting name associated with modern sort of UFO ideas. And then '90s, you have a lot of other interesting things come up with Aurora. The spaceman exposed as a hoax still draws the curious. All these other interesting articles, again, the Dallas Morning News continues to write about it despite their attempts to downplay it all. It's kind of funny how that works. In '91, books started coming out. This Sheridan book, the Great Texas Airship Mystery, pretty cool. It's not just about Aurora, it talks about all these. There's Randall talking about, and Don Schmidt talking about the Roswell case. They allude to others like Aurora as being, you know, examples in hoaxes. Magonia, Nigel Watson, a UK investigator, longtime reporter, researcher, wrote about it in Magonia. In 1993, one of the living people who, as at the time, saw the original headstone, describes where it was on a video that they took. In '94, Fox had this series called Encounters, and they did an episode specifically about it called the Astronaut UFO Encounters, which is pretty cool that Fox is, you know, trying to focus a little bit on this in the '90s. You know, the Star Telegram starts to write about it as well, and this book, The Complete Sightings of UFOs, includes it in there. In '96, people are sending things to the Wise County Historical Commission, and again, they're getting all kinds of newsletters, articles, mail. It's a central hub for Aurora at this point. And very, very interestingly enough, in 1997, not only here in Roswell, but they held holding the 50th anniversary, which was really cool to think. My buddy Jim was here, and it's great to see how this event, the Roswell UFO Festival, has been going on for so long now, and that it's because of the legacy research like those of my buddy Jim and Stan Friedman and the longtime Roswell and just other researchers have helped to make this all happen. Anyway, it was also the 100th anniversary of Aurora. It's incredible to think how that has been that long, but there were a lot of different specials. The show Sightings did a special on the 100-year cover-up, which it featured Aurora. MUFON also launched an investigation into Aurora. John Schuessler published an entire thing about it, and they found metal. They found molten states of what had originally been molten metal that had strange compositions, which was one of the leading giveaways that something could have happened to explode or cause high, just high levels of heat that made melted metal or something like that. And also, Jim came out with his book, Alien Agenda. At one of the times, it was the best-selling nonfiction book on UFOs in the world, which included Aurora, which is one of the main reasons people learned about the story. So there he is. There's Jim. In '98, some people attended the Texas Folklore Society annual meeting and proposed that a monument should be erected. And funnily enough, they laughed at the idea, and they're like, this is silly. At a folklore society of Texas. I mean, I don't know if you guys, I can think of one, I don't want to derail too much, I can think of one other big, folklore type thing. There's a few from Texas specifically, that's where I am, so my home base kind of revolves around that sort of folklore and stories, urban legends. But next to the Chupacabra, which isn't even the original El Chupacabras from Puerto Rico, the Chupacabra is probably about the only other urban legend, folklore type thing that people know outside of Aurora. I don't know if you guys can think of any, and some of you might, but you might know about the Goat Man or something like that. Texas has a lot of really strange, creepy, and weird stuff going on, but I don't know that anything really stands out internationally next to Aurora. So to think that this is 98, so don't blame them. But they laughed at the idea of having a monument. Someone thought that was a serious thing to consider them. Also, what's really cool is the Fox News anchor at the time, Richard Ray, held a series called the Tex Files, played on the X Files, which he did several episodes on many things. One of them was with the Aurora alien, which had Jim drawing out. He was an artist, by the way, too. He loved drawing, so I love this picture. It's a part of a news clip. He's drawing that other half of the gravestone, the original one, trying to show that he thought it was a complete picture, which is cool. In '99, the Wise County publishes that people are seeing UFOs again. They published UFO reports, so not only do we have Roswell Daily Record sharing now about news reports and things, but people, they thought, hey, we have something to do with that stuff. Let's tell about this, rather than say, no, we don't want this. So it's cool that they did that in '99. In 2000, Jim actually started teaching a course on UFOs and JFK, if you're familiar with his work. But for UFOs, they used his Alien Agenda as a textbook, and that's kind of a fun picture that someone drew on his chalkboard. And he continued to do that for several years at University of North Texas. In 2001, there was an inventory taken of the cemetery, and they found 1,450 graves with no indication of someone named Hayden being buried. So maybe that means that either he wasn't buried, he did die in Texas, or maybe he never died. No, I think that he's just not in Texas anymore. I think he went to California. 2002, this is kind of an interesting time, so I'm going to fly through a lot of this as we're getting close to the modern time frame. Really cool, Highway 114, as I mentioned before, was the main highway that goes right through Aurora. And because of that, the local family, the Durdings, established what they like to call Area 114, obviously play on Area 51, and they launched a website, AuroraAlien.com. I don't think it works now, but they opened a shop, it got published in the newspaper, a bunch of novelty items, hats, mugs, shirts, things like that. And they plastered Area 114 with the little alien logo on stuff, and it was a cool idea to try to bring in and encourage commerce, bring in tourism. But again, nothing nearly as big as Roswell. It's a very small town. Jim Mars put together a documentary. It's interesting how this works. It was called Aurora, the UFO crash of 1897. And after the fact that he made this, and this happens with doing this research, people will come to you and say, you know what, I know about this. So you find things out after the fact that you write a book or you publish research or do something like this or on a show or something. And this guy came forward and showed, Jim, I have a medallion. I have metal that was from the crash that we kept, as the story tells, that we picked up pieces of and we held on to for years that no one's ever asked us about. So people have come forward with bits of the metal and things. And the following year, Fate magazine actually did a special on it. And the Aurora encounter got put on DVD, which is awesome. So 2004, more books come out. This one by Busby there, solving the 1897 airship mystery. And then there were conferences. This one I don't think has been around for a while now. It's called the UFO Crash Retrieval Conference. And Jim gave a lecture on Aurora, probably one of the first in that capacity. And then here's how it starts really getting well known. The History Channel descends upon Aurora as well, and they do a documentary put together by John Greenwald of the Black Vault. Before his, well-known kind of connections with that now, he was doing stuff like this. This is his first big project with History Channel. It was called the UFO File, or Texas Roswell. That was the name of the episode, but UFO Files is the show. Author and researcher Ryan Wood, who wrote Magic Eyes Only, which does feature Aurora, was featured on Coast to Coast AM the following year, and tells about how there's all this stuff that goes back to 1897. People question if that's legitimate. It gets into the sort of the interplanetary anomalous unit and all these things, the majestic documents. So people, can say whatever they want, but Coast to Coast gets millions of listeners. So there's getting out there. And now I'm going to have some fun with this. WGN, which is a news outlet, after the Chicago O'Hare incident in 2006, they went and asked people at the Chicago O'Hare airport, what do you think about UFOs? We just had this sighting here, got kind of noisy with people talking about it. And they just said, like, oh, look at this guy. He probably would be a good one to interview. And so this is an interview that they captured.
Did WGN ever reconnect with the UFO guy Juan Carlos interviewed at O'Hare? Well, we tried to find this guy, and we even left messages with his mother and grandmother somewhere in Texas, but we could never find him. Take a look at Juan Carlos's conversation with the UFO guy.
What do you think? Do you believe in UFOs?
Oh yeah, yes sir, definitely. They're out there, man. I seen them. I've been out there in Aurora, Texas. They got them little graves and stuff. Yeah, I've been out there, and I don't know, I'm planning a trip. We're going out to like Arizona or something and figure something out. Or not Arizona, what was it? Yeah, it was Arizona, right? The Air Force One, where they found all that stuff. I got pictures of Aurora. I seen grave sites. They're out there, man. And I'm flying in the plane. I'm always hallucinating, but who really knows what I'm looking at? You know what I'm saying? Okay.
Well, but there's no proof of this. Just people's accounts.
You're right. There's no proof. But I mean, there's no proof of Jesus or people go in the restroom until they tell you about it. You know what I mean? I mean, that's just kind of the way I see things.
So you believe in that?
Oh, definitely.
Do you think there's like little green men out there?
No little green men, sir.
No? Well, what do you think there is out there?
Who knows, dude? They could be made of water. I don't even know.
Water?
Water, man. You heard the man. Water. They could be made of anything. Extraterrestrial.
Extraterrestrial, you mean?
That extraterrestrial. Extraterrestrial.
There you go.
All right, so it's kind of fun. I'm going to run through these as we're kind of coming to the close here. So 2008, of course, the History Channel comes back with the show UFO Hunters. Featured Jim on there. They've got Bill Burns, Pat Husker, and a number of other investigators. This episode is called First Contact. They go in, they unsealed that well from the 57. They sit Pat Husker down, who I got to know for a while. And they unfortunately, they didn't find anything in the well, which that would have been really awesome if they did. They found a snake, but they let the snake go. But they also did ground penetrating radar. This is one of the two main things people always ask me, why don't they just do that or something? So they did ground penetrating radar over the grave, and the main thing I can say about that is they did find something about the size of a small child-sized grave, but they couldn't determine the contents of the grave. So that happened. More news reports, books, really cool stuff throughout the next few years. Of course, Ancient Aliens comes out, and they did an episode on it as well called Aliens in the Old West. Really cool. So the following year, I have to do this, so I'm going to apologize ahead of time. So someone remixed that video, and I'm going to let you guys enjoy this for a moment.
Well, we tried to find this guy, and we even left messages with his mother and grandmother somewhere in Texas, but we could never
course, he was confusing Air Force One for Area 51, which he was confusing for Roswell. There's so much going on there, but it's great. Okay, so in 2012, a new headstone got put into place. In 2013, it was stolen. Yeah, more books. This guy George Judding's written like dozens of books. He wrote one on Aurora, which is pretty cool. One of the first, only books on Aurora. Still making news throughout the years. More books, really cool stuff going on. My buddy Noah Torres with John LeMay, who's here as well. They did a lot of really cool series. I don't have time to get into that. New grave in 2015. I'm going to run through this new city logo, new administrative people involved who encourage, embrace the theme, utilize it for branding, marketing as best they can, and that's one of their cards. Really cool stuff going on here. Dr. Tony Wheeler. I got to meet with her, and I'll say this really quick. How many of you have heard about Ned in relation to this story? Like you hear Ned. That's probably good that not many people have. Because sometimes I come and they're like, oh yeah, Ned, they call him Ned. I'm like, how do you know that? Like, why do you know that people call him Ned? And the reason is, I'll tell you why. Dr. Tony Wheeler, who as a girl grew up in Aurora, was told the story by the old timers who worked at the cemetery watch. Their name was Ned. As she became older, became the city administrator, someone gave her a little dummy alien, which she affectionately called Ned, which I then paraded around, went on tour with, and we had a lot of fun. So I went up to City Hall with Jim Mars that year, met with the city council, we started planning an event. We went to the crash sites and grave site extensively to really kind of get an idea. Jim was so passionate about it. It was so cool to see his interest, enthusiasm, and I'm very honored to have worked with him. He was very much like a mentor, a big reason why I'm doing any of this stuff. But it was like we were on the news, had a lot of really cool stuff. We were on the first ever, and probably only ever, Aurora Alien Encounter, 2016. So just to get wrapping up here, great event, sold out event. Travis Walton was there. We held tours. There I am, him and Noah Torres. Ned's making breaking the news. Of course, he starts kind of getting a little bit, big in the head and starts wanting to kind of get out there more. So they held a haunted house, which is cool. This was slated for the following year, but it was canceled because unfortunately Jim passed away. So rest in peace, buddy. There's a monument due to the success of the event they established. You can go see this today. There's Ned showing off his really cool spaceship when he crashed. He messed up, and now we have a monument about it. So I took him around. Here he is in Roswell during the 70th anniversary. Here, this is the left picture. Actually, both of these are here before they remodeled it. Josh Gates was here at the Roswell Incident event back in 2017. I won the costume contest with Ned. Ned won it, and I'm just holding him there. We appeared on Expedition Unknown, so Ned's getting some notoriety. I was fortunate to be featured in this 2018 article in The Messenger. We held a huge event. A Dallas lawyer offered a reward for the original headstone. Now it's up to $10,000. Carrie Haggard wrote Traveler, which is the fictionalized version. I take Ned on tour. He got a little sad. We got him in a wheelchair. So we tried to cheer him up a little bit. So he's having a moment to enjoy things. We went to all kinds of events. We're all over the place. Ned, I got him buttons, patches. He visited some friends. We went out to Area 51. We finally got up there. But of course, most notably Roswell. He loved Roswell for sure. And so the city hall erected this really cool plaque or stand. They started Area 114. I'm going to wrap this up. So basically, it was a cool party patio idea with Martian margaritas, which they made Ned's own beer, Alien Ale. There he is in his wheelchair. They had smoking windmill barbecue with their menu item, UFO. Now, we'll play this, but I just want to point out, the news station looked back and was like, this is one of our top watched news stories ever. Millions of people saw this. And they're like, we got to get this guy back. Turns out he became a top naval flight instructor. And these are just a few comments out of dozens that they're like, I know this guy. So the irony is that he probably knows more about UFOs than anybody at this point. It's just kind of funny to think how that worked out. Later on, I got to do a news segment. I don't have time for this. It's pretty cool. It's on my YouTube channel, The Vortex. Tragedy strikes Aurora again. That former city admin, or became former Tony Wheeler, something mysterious happened and City Hall burns down. And then she's found to have stolen nearly $1 million. So I think Ned was inside. So unfortunately, Ned's no more. He burned down for the second time. And Smoking Windmill Barbecue had to move down the street, so they have a nice new venue. You can go there now. It's really awesome. I did an anniversary live stream there on location. That's what the well looks like today, as well as the gravesite. New plans. The city was in shambles. They tried to sort of recuperate. They have new ideas for City Hall. What's really cool is the museum. They do have a plaque about Aurora. It's not the old headstone, which I talked with them about. Some people there have kind of changed around, but I used to go to the Heritage Museum for research on their original records and archived material originals. I put together a fun little project. A new Ned, I call him Jim. You know, Tony called him Ned because that's how she learned about it. I call this guy Jim just for fun. Because it's, you know, Jim Mars is kind of funny because they called him, he said he was from Mars, you know. Jim is my buddy, so we dug him up. He's here. We just did it for the weekend. He's still fresh, so you can go check him out in the corner up there in the hallway. It's got his papers, his flowers, his crumpled up metal. Chase Howard took this. He's here. He's helping out with the event. I approached City Council about trying to help, you know, get this back and going again. Astral puts together awesome spaces for what's called UFO Twitter Week. Please check out UFO Twitter if you can. We did a whole space. Chase and I went out live on location. Then now this year, to wrap this up, this was here back in March. Here in this room we had UFO Expo, so we debuted them, and unfortunately tragic things happened again. That same museum that I was just at back in March caught fire and everything's destroyed. Strange theme of a fire. I won't say anything more than 50 years apart. I went back to I did a photo analysis on this. I tried to locate sort of how that photo was taken. It's not exactly in the same spot. That's 50 years apart exactly. I did that back on the 14th this month, or last month technically now. And one more slide before I go to the very last one. I want to show you because this was just yesterday. Check this out. So this is totally unexpected. How many of you guys saw Tim Burchett yesterday or knew that he was going to be here? So in closing, basically, I'll tell this. So this right here. That was him in the other room. He unannounced brought up Aurora, and because of that, I went and asked him what he thinks about looking into this historical side of things can do for us today. He responded. That was just yesterday. So I'll wrap all of this up by saying, I'm very honored to be able to share about this fun, inspiring bit of folklore as I see it. Fact, fiction, or folklore. This is important. And so the publication I've been working on, which has been delayed further and further, mainly due to unsuspected tragedies like city halls and museums burning down, has been proved to be quite an interesting challenge. But this publication I'm coming out with, it has all of this and much more information. I would just say, again, it's been an honor to be able to come and share this with you guys. I appreciate everyone's time. I know there's a lot more going on. Please let me know if you have anything you'd like to share. We don't have time for Q&A at the moment. I'm going to be here all day long. Definitely check out the program if you have any questions. I'll be glad to get with you then. Thank you all for your time. Appreciate it.